Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about poverty and economic inequality. And the idea here is that we want to look at some different programs, some different ways economists look at income and budgets and economic inequality, some different measures we have of poverty, the difference between different measures of poverty, and then different programs designed to either alleviate poverty or to help solve problems of economic and income inequality. So there's going to be some cool stuff that we talk about, some history, some modeling, and a lot of data. There's going to be a lot of key terms. We're going to talk about a lot of different policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC. We're going to talk about estate tax. We're going to talk about effective income tax. We'll talk about what income actually is and a little bit of an economic definition of income, also income inequality. We'll learn about the Lorenz curve, which is a measure of economic inequality for countries and groups. We'll talk about Medicaid, a federal and state program that tries to help alleviate poverty by reducing medical costs. We'll talk about poverty, the poverty line, the poverty rate, the poverty trap, and also families and households that are near poor. We'll talk about a progressive tax system and what that actually means. We'll talk about a tool we use to divide groups based on their income called quintiles, which is really just dividing people up into fifths. So that's easy. We'll talk about redistribution. We'll talk about safety net programs and what a safety net is. We'll also talk about the program SNAP, otherwise known as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is kind of generically known as food stamps. And then we'll talk about wealth generally and how it compares to income, and ways that it's similar and dissimilar from income. And so those are sort of the big concepts or the big key terms. We'll talk about, deriving poverty lines, describing the poverty trap, describing programs that contribute to the social safety net, the ideas of income inequality, government policies, their role, and the role of wealth. So let's get into it. Get your notes. I'm going to pull up the slides and we can start talking about Chapter 15 in your OpenStax textbook. Okie doke, here we go. So this is Chapter 15, looking at poverty and income inequality. And so we're going to go through 5 different sections in this chapter. We'll start with drawing the poverty line, really articulating what we mean by poverty and defining it. We'll talk about the poverty trap, the idea that people can become trapped in poverty without any real means of escaping it. And then we'll talk about some ways that we can prevent that. We'll talk about the safety net programs that are designed to help low-income households escape poverty and prevent them from sort of abject poverty. And then we'll talk about income inequality. We'll talk about how we measure it, what some of the causes are, and what we might be able to do about that. And that'll lead us right to the last section, which is government policies designed to reduce that income inequality that we can see in certain countries. And there's a lot of terminology and programs here that you might have heard about socially and commonly and on the news. And so this is a great opportunity to get a deeper understanding of something that you probably have encountered to some extent. And so the book starts out with the example of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the Occupy Wall Street movement began in 2011 as a response to the Great Recession. Excuse me, the Great Recession. And so the idea was that we saw a lot of people lose their homes, their pensions, their savings, and their jobs in the wake of the Great Recession and the housing crisis. And then what we saw was a lot of wealth continue to be redistributed to the richest and wealthiest Americans. And so the Occupy Wall Street movement was sort of the first big outcry about that, and it sort of began the conversation about the wealthiest 1% of Americans and how wealth was concentrated and distributed. And so this kind of brings us to what we're talking about. And we still struggle with these issues in the US and in other countries today. These issues of how much wealth is concentrated at the very top versus at the bottom, and what the difference is between the richest and the poorest of us. And so that's the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about in this chapter. And so to do that, we need to get some common language. So we need to know what poverty means. And poverty is just measured by the number of people who fall below a certain level of income. And that's going to be what we call the poverty line. So the idea is we set a poverty line and it says, okay, anybody earning less than this amount of money, this income, is not going to be able to enjoy a basic standard of living. And so the poverty line is going to be a function of income and then also the cost of living in that country. And so the poverty line is going to be localized, right? So living in poverty in the Bay Area might be a different income level than living in poverty in rural Oklahoma or something like that, versus living in poverty in Madagascar or rural China or urban Japan. And when we talk about poverty and the poverty line, we can also talk about the poverty rate. And the poverty rate is just the percentage of the population living below the poverty line. And so we have this idea of poverty and low income, poor households, and they might be below that poverty line, that sort of threshold of poverty. And then the poverty rate is the proportion of people who are below that poverty line. And then finally, income inequality is going to be a comparison of the levels of income that different groups in society have. And we'll get more into this when we start talking about quintiles and that kind of thing. But the general idea there is that income is not equal. And so how unequal is it? How far are the richest from the poorest? Are they relatively close? Are they quite far? And what are the implications of that? And if you're wondering why economists care about this, we tend to see that poverty and income inequality can lead to economic and political instability. And so there is this sense of, even in sort of the strictest economic interpretation, that poverty and income inequality are generally not good things. And we'll talk about that more towards the end of the chapter. So when we look at the poverty rate over time, we can look at it overall, and we can see here that poverty dropped a lot in the 60s, but it rose again in the 80s, the early 90s, and then again in the Great Recession in response to economic conditions, right? So we saw a lot of economic growth in the late 50s and early 60s and early 70s, and we see that represented in falling poverty rates. Obviously, we had a massive economic crisis in 2007, 2008, and we see the poverty rate rise dramatically in response to that. In 2013, the poverty rate actually dropped to 14.5%. And if you go to the US Census Bureau today, you can see the current poverty rate. And it's really easy. You can just pop it in your search engine and just say, US poverty rate, US Census Bureau, and get the current data pretty simply. And if that's something you're interested in, let me know, and we'll take a look at the current data, because I always think that's fun. The other thing we can think about is that the poverty rate is going to be different for different groups. We tend to see women have higher rates of poverty than men, and we tend to see Hispanic and Black households and individuals have higher rates of poverty than white and Asian households and individuals. And so it's not just a straight story. We can kind of divide it out, break it down, and tease out some more detail in there. So the other thing we see, and the book has this, is a table where we look at poverty based on age. We tend to see younger people have a little bit higher rates of poverty, either because they're getting an education, starting out their careers, and then much lower rates of poverty for people over 65, because they tend to get a lot of government assistance at that age, and they also tend to be, retired. So that leads us to the poverty trap. And so if we think about what a poverty trap is, we're going to explain what a poverty trap is, and we want to talk about how government programs can impact it, how we might improve on those traditional government programs, and then we'll also use this model called a budget constraint. This is a really fun model, has a lot of practical applications. I will show you how to graph it. And it's very similar to a production possibilities frontier. So if you remember what that PPF model looks like, it's going to be very similar to that, except we'll be talking about money. So the big idea with this poverty trap is it possible to give people too much help or the wrong kind of help? When we think about poverty, one of the first instincts is that we want to try and provide low income and poor individuals, people living in poverty, with their basic necessities: food, shelter, healthcare, income. But remember that economics is all about incentives. And so if we're giving these things away to people, we might reduce their incentive to work, especially if our government programs are not very well designed. And so one of the things we'll see is a poverty trap is an anti-poverty program that is designed in such a way that it actually provides a disincentive to go to work. And so the example in the book is that, let's say you have a program where you give people money for basic necessities based on their poverty. The more they work, the more money they earn. But as they start earning more money, you start to reduce their benefits. If every time I make another $100, I lose another $100 in government benefits, then what's my incentive to go to work, right? It's actually better for me if I don't spend time working. So we're going to see a graph of this, but this is the basic idea of a poverty trap, where going to work provides little or no financial gain overall. So you can look here, and this is the example from the book talking about this labor leisure budget constraint. And I think this model is hard to understand, so I'm going to draw it for you first, and then we'll look at the book's example. Okay, so this is a little bit different from other models we've done, and so I just want to kind of go over how we would frame this. And so we're going to have income up here on our y-axis, and then down here we're going to have hours. And you can do hours in a day, or you can do hours in a year, or in a week, or in a month. But what we're looking at here is this idea of the trade-off between labor and leisure. And so what we've got up here on the board is going to be, we can have leisure hours up first, and I'll do it in different colors. So we can have leisure hours going from 0 to 2,500. And we're going to have it go this way, and that's leisure, right? And then if you're not engaging in, the way we model this is if you're not engaging in leisure, then you're engaging in some kind of labor. You're working. And so we'll put labor the same. It's going to be either 2,500 or 0, and that's labor. And so wherever you are, you're spending your time doing one of those things, right? So you can have 2,500 hours, 2,000 hours, and 500 hours, 1,500 hours, and 1,000 hours, 1,000 hours, and 1,500 hours, so that you're using that same 2,500 hours divided up into different points. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully. So like at this point here, maybe it's you'd be spending 500 hours working, and you'd spend 2,000 hours doing leisure. And then maybe over here we have the same sort of point where it's 500 hours of leisure and 2,000 hours of labor. Does that make sense? Kind of? Hopefully. That's the idea. So you have 0 and 2,000. So you're doing all work over here, all play over here, or some combination of the two. Okay? And then the other thing we have going on in this model is we have two forms of income. There's the government subsidy, or the labor, the money you get from working, right? And so the more hours you spend working, the more your income's going to go up. But we also have this anti-poverty program. So the book says, okay, let's assume that there's an anti-poverty program where you make $18,000 if you don't work. And so that's going to be this line right here. Right? That's our anti-poverty program. That's a guaranteed income, right? That's what the book calls it, the income. If you start working, you're going to make some money. But as you make more money, you might see a decrease in your ability to get this guaranteed income. And so what the book says is with the guaranteed income, the family can receive $18,000 whether they provide 0 hours of work or 2,000 hours of work. So 2,000 hours of labor, that's going to be right here. 2,000 hours of labor, 500 hours of leisure. That's going to be this point. Right? At that point where they're working 2,000 hours of labor and 500 hours of leisure, that's going to be that cutoff point for this program. And so what we'll see is their budget constraint is going to be based off of that program. And so as they increase the number of hours of labor from 0 here to 500 here to, say, 1,000 and all the way up to 2,000, their income will rise. But as their income rises, they might lose that guaranteed income. And so what we could see is if the family's trying to decide how many hours to work, they're going to want to compare this sort of combination of their income from working and the income they could get from not working. Right? And that's what we're talking about with this idea of this poverty trap is what are the actual returns to working relative to not working? Does that kind of make sense? So let's go back now that we have a little bit of a sense of how this graph works and look at the slides. So if the family's original position was, oops, I did this wrong. If the family's original position was to be working, right, 2,000 hours, and they would then make $16,000. I messed this up. I'm so sorry. If they're working 2,000 hours, and that's going to make them $6,000 or $16,000, they could be at this point A. Now, with government assistance, it says, hey, listen, if you don't make very much money, we'll give you some guaranteed income. We'll supplement your income at a level of $18,000 if you meet our requirements. That'll be the guaranteed income. So you can either not work at all and make $18,000 or work 2,000 hours and make $16,000. Do you see how that's kind of a weird perspective and a weird incentive? So if you could be either here working 2,000 hours with 500 hours off and make $16,000, or you could be anywhere else on this point to all the way to the point of not working any hours and get a guaranteed income that's higher. The idea is you're basically giving away money by working because you'd make less money if you went to work than if you just assumed the minimum guaranteed income. And even if you do work, the increase in income is small relative to how much work you're doing, right? So you would have to work, say, 2,300 hours to get up to that free income that you would get if you were not working at all. And so that's this idea of a poverty trap, is this idea that maybe we might be incentivizing people to not work by providing them with too much guaranteed income. A little caveat here, there are some programs that look at guaranteed basic income or universal basic income programs. They're usually very low income programs. And we tend to see that as long as you give people the money regardless of work, you actually increase the incentive to work and you increase their productivity. But that is not in the textbook. That is a whole other separate body of research that we could talk about later after class maybe. So how might we fix the poverty trap problem? Well, the way we would want to do it is try and create two different systems where instead of just giving people $18,000, regardless of what they do, and it's an all or nothing, a switch. You either get this or you work. You're either on the purple line or you're on the blue line. we could make it more like the model here, where instead of choosing between not working and making $18,000 or working and making $16,000, we slowly reduce the government benefits by less than the increase in work. So the example here is that a person can choose to work those 2,000 hours and have 500 hours of leisure and make $16,000. That's that point P. Or if they work 0 hours, they'll get that full benefit, the $1,800 or the $18,000. But as they increase their labor, the benefits will reduce by less than the increase in income. And so this way, they can work a little bit or a lot and get the benefit of income and still some government benefits. And so we're not reducing the incentive to work by as much. And so the idea here is for every additional dollar earned through labor, the benefits are phased out by less than $1. So there's still benefits out there, and it's not taking away the support while providing that incentive of, hey, listen, the benefits are never going to get you as high as benefits and work would. So why not work and make more money? Does that kind of make sense? Let me know. I can go over this graph too if you guys are interested in it. Okay, cool. So the idea of this program is that it provides an incentive to work the same or more hours depending on your income assistance. The recipient of assistance could choose to work 0 hours, but as they increase their labor, say they want to be on point S, they'll be working a decent amount of hours, they'll still get some leisure time, and they'll have higher income than they would have without government assistance. At point R, they're working even more, and they're making more income, and that's going to increase that incentive to work more, because as they increase their working hours, they're still seeing an increase in total income because the incentive program is still there supporting their choice to go back to work. Does that kind of make sense? So that's the idea here, is that maybe let's draw it this way, instead of having this purple line like this, we keep the original choice of, okay, do you want to work or not? And then we add this second higher income line that is the government assistance program. So this is $2,000 or $20,000. And then there's this second program up here at $28,000 that says, hey, listen, as you work more, we're going to give you an incentive where if you work 0 hours, you'll still make the $18,000, but the more you work, the combination of your income and the government assistance will push you at a higher income line. So the more you work, the more money you make. So that's a good incentive, right? That's the way we want it to work. So that's the idea of sort of loosening the poverty trap. And if you're still a little bit iffy on it, check out the textbook. They have the sort of numeric examples in there where you can see the combination of government support income and earning income and total income and how that would work. So when we talk about these kinds of programs that alleviate poverty, what we're talking about is the safety net. And the safety net is just a group of government programs that provides assistance to poor people and near poor people. And near poor people are people just above the poverty line. So you're not counted as being in poverty technically, but you're on that borderline, right? You can see poverty from here. And so the idea is that, not all poor people live under the poverty line. There are a lot of people who are very, very close to that poverty line. I'll never forget a friend of mine missed out on public assistance. She had multiple sclerosis. She had MS, and she couldn't get public health care because her family made pennies, literally pennies more than the poverty line, put them out of reach of that. And so that would be very close to poor, but not poor enough for the programs. And so the safety net's designed to help people. And there are a lot of programs that have existed and do exist to try and support low-income families and families in poverty and the near poor. The first is temporary assistance for needy families, and this is it was passed in 1996 by the Clinton administration and Congress, and it's designed to help provide support for low-income families while also providing incentives to work, putting time limits on it, sometimes having a lot of constraints on it. And so the idea is that it's supposed to be one of these not poverty trap programs because it's going to give families that safety net, that financial assistance, but with other carrots and sticks associated with going back to work. The TANF or TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, has been generally pretty productive. It gives states a combination of federal aid and state aid. According to the Congressional Research Service, by 2012, the average number of families receiving payments from the program decreased by more than half, which lets us know that the program's working, right? It's pushing people out of poverty. It benefits poor families across states, and it depends on what the sort of requirements are in your given state, but it generally seemed to be a pretty popular program. Another way that we help low-income families in the United States is the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit was passed in 1975, and the idea is that if you are a working poor person or a working poor family, you'll get a credit on your taxes to supplement your income. And so it's the thing of where lower income people are more likely to get a tax credit than actually have to pay taxes at the end of the year. So for example, in 2013, a single parent with 2 children would have received a tax credit of $5,000, more than $5,000 if their income was $17,530 or less. And so it's basically putting a credit on people who make a small amount of money, and helping them reduce their tax liability, increase their income. And that's one of the reasons why economists tend to, the Earned Income Tax Credit is really popular with economists, because it doesn't disincentivize work. It just rewards poverty, kind of, right? So it doesn't affect the incentive to work. It's not dependent on wages in a daily sense. It's in an annual sense. And so the idea is that it's going to do a really good job of providing that social safety net while still incentivizing work. Another program that you're probably familiar with is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And this is generally what we think of and what we mean when we're talking about food stamps. It's a federally funded program, and it basically gives low-income households, it used to be literal stamps like coupons. Now it's usually a debit card, and it's resources, it's money that can be spent on certain food items. There are restrictions on it, and it is supposed to be basically it's based on the expectation that households spend about 30% of their income on food. And so we want to supplement nutrition, supplement people's ability to buy food. It's a pretty popular program. There are, like I said, a lot of restrictions. One of the things we find in a lot of these safety net programs is the United States really does not like the idea of just giving people money. And so they would much rather have it have certain constraints and limitations so that they can kind of control what it's spent on. And when we think about the size of these programs, you can compare them here by just looking at the millions of dollars of expenditure that they are producing. So SNAP down here costs what is this? Less than $10,000, $10 billion. Here's TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. HUD is a housing subsidy program. Housing subsidies, basically, it's usually housing vouchers, so low-income households can get the equivalent of a coupon from the government that allows them to supplement their housing expenditure, and then other income security programs here. So total expenditure on these programs has risen a lot, especially you can see a big jump in HUD and other income security programs in the wake of the Great Recession. Payments for TANF have where the temporary assistance for needy family have increased from $13 billion in 1998 to about $17.3 billion in 2013. SNAP has not changed that much, and we've talked a lot recently in the political sphere about cutting SNAP benefits. These two programs are two of the smaller programs relative to the other programs that we see, and you can see that housing, obviously, the book notes that the housing subsidies really increased in the wake of the housing crisis in 2008 and 2010. So, other programs, another program that's designed to create a social safety net or provide basic resources for households is Medicaid. Medicaid is a health insurance program, and it's funded and managed by states and the federal government, and it's designed to provide medical insurance for low-income households, especially children, especially people with disabilities, and the elderly. And the idea here is that we don't want very low income or marginalized people to face cost as a barrier to medical care, because that's going to generally raise the cost of that care long term, right? Prevention is cheaper than curing problems. And it gets to this idea that we talked about a couple chapters ago about public goods. And so health is a public good. And when people are ill and can't afford medical care, it generates negative externalities because we all end up subsidizing that. And so the idea is that by providing medical care, providing joint health insurance for low-income people, the elderly, the poor, and children, we can prevent those negative healthcare outcomes and reduce the cost of just healthcare in general for society. Medicaid began in 1965. It tends to be really popular during economic recessions when people lose their jobs and then lose their health insurance. And we've seen in recent years with the Affordable Care Act an expansion of Medicaid with the hopes that by expanding it, we can lower healthcare costs by increasing prevention. And so you'll see like preventative healthcare be much more subsidized through a lot of these programs than other programs. And that's this idea of generating this public good, this positive externality good of public health. So here you can see Medicaid enrollment and spending. Here's Medicaid enrollment, and we see it's mostly children enrolled, although disabled people make up the majority of the expenditure. And that kind of makes sense, right? The idea is we enroll children at a high rate, but they're generally low cost to care for because children tend to be fairly healthy, whereas we provide it as a safety net for the disabled population, but they're going to tend to need more medical care, and so they're going to make up a smaller portion of enrollment but a larger portion of expenditure. Same for older people. As we have the older population opt into Medicaid, they're not going to make up a large proportion of enrollment, but they're going to be more likely to have higher costs. And then adults, it's a little bit of the in-between, right? They're going to be a smaller proportion than children because it's really truly going to be based on income qualification, and we're going to expect them to generally be a little bit more affordable in terms of providing care to them. So now we can talk about income inequality and talk about the measures and the causes of income inequality. And income inequality is just this idea that the richest people have more money than the poorest people, and how far apart is that? And this is one of the things that gets lost when we look at things like averages. Like if we look at average GDP or a per capita GDP for a country, that just tells us one thing. It doesn't tell us how far the poorest of the poor are from the richest of the rich. And so the way we generally look at income inequality is by dividing the population into quintiles. And quintiles are just fifths. So if I have 100 people in my population, right? I have 100 people from 0 to 100 in my population. I can divide them into fifths, and I'll have the top quintile here, and then the fourth, the third, the second, and then the lowest quintile here. And so it's really just a way of dividing up a group of people. So we take the total population and divide them into fifths in terms of the poorest and the wealthiest. And that helps us measure income inequality. And there's a great table that looks at income inequality in the United States going from 1967, 1970, 75, 80, 85, 90. And you can see the share of income held by the top quintile rise, but also the share held by the top 5%. And that's another thing that economists will do is they'll say, okay, here's the top quintile, and then now here's the, say, top 5%, or even, like we talked about with Occupy Wall Street, the top 1%. And so how much wealth is being held by that proportion. And generally in the United States, the highest quintile has held more than 40% of the income, meaning the remaining 60% is divided between these other groups. The Lorenz graph, or the Lorenz curve, is a graph that tries to look at the cumulative income received to different quintiles of population. And so basically what it looks at is how much income is held by people in a cumulative distribution. And so if we think about the Lorenz curve, I'll give you a quick and dirty version of it here, comparing this quintile. It's basically taking the quintiles and putting them down on the x-axis and then comparing it to income. So let me show you my quick and dirty version, and then we'll show you the pretty book version. So if we have the total population down here, with this being 100%, and then we can divide it into quintiles, right? 20, 40, 60, 80, and then 100. And then we can do the same thing over here with income, and we can see that if the income was divided evenly, with the first 20% having 20% of income, the next 40% having 40% of income, the next 20% 60%, the next 80% 80, and 100, we would have perfect income equality. But what we're going to tend to see is a lot more of the income is held by these people than these people. So maybe in 2013, the lowest quintile of the population in the United States had 3%, give or take, of the income. So that's going to put them right here. That's our first line in the Lorenz curve. The next quintile has 8%. 8.4 plus 3.2 is going to give us a little bit more than 11%. So that's going to be more like this. And so what we see is as this line gets further from this equal distribution graph, we're going to see greater income inequality. In 2013, the next quintile had 14%, so 14 plus 8 plus 3, that's going to give us 25-ish. Let's put it right about here, and so on. And so that's how you would graph the Lorenz curve. And then the next quintile has another 23%, so it's going to be more like this. And then the last 100% gets the rest of the income. So that's my wonky representation of the Lorenz curve for the United States in 2013. Here you can see an example, and this is the Lorenz curve for the United States in 1980 and then 2011. And you can see as it moves further away from perfect equality, what we're seeing is a more unequal distribution of income, increasing income inequality over time. And so that's how we can measure that. That Lorenz curve helps us see that change in income inequality, that increasing income inequality over time in the United States. So why might that be happening? There's lots of reasons. There's lots of reasons why we might be seeing growth in income inequality. It could be that it's just a sort of positive feedback loop. What we tend to see is high income earners tend to produce high income earners, right? If you make a lot of money, you can afford good schools for your kids, best advantages, you can give them social benefits that other kids can't, especially if there are two high earners. And we're going to tend to see that a lot with just sort of how people match up. two people with high incomes are more likely to match with each other than two people without high incomes. And so that's going to increase the probability of their children having high income, especially if we add in the component of wealth, which we haven't yet. The other thing we can see is that single parent households are going to tend to contribute to poverty rates. And that's just because they're going to have a smaller income relative to a two-parent household. And as we see the rise in single parent households, we're going to see rising income inequality. There's a lot more of a nuanced discussion to be had to this. There's a lot of things that we can talk about, and we're going to talk about more of it in the next chapter. Economists have a lot of different ideas about why we may be seeing changes in income inequality over time. And these are just two ideas that we can think about. The other things we can consider are things like the nature of the technological change we've experienced. We've seen the returns to high-skilled labor grow and the returns to low-skilled labor fall. And so it used to be that there was not a huge wage disparity between high-skilled or highly educated or highly trained labor and low-skilled or low-trained, low-educated labor. That has changed a lot. The distribution between the incomes that can be earned has really changed. And there's also this development of what the book calls a winner-take-all labor market, where there's a demand for, quote, stars. And so the idea is that some people have really big wage differentials relative to the average person. And that can be from the increase in technology that has focused on wage returns to high-skilled labor. It can be based on global demand, really having higher returns for high-skilled workers and really lowering the returns for low-skilled workers. And you can also argue that the salary gap between the median and the top 1% is not really due to educational differences. It could be due to changes in opportunity and truly due to that idea of globalization. And so there's really a lot of factors at play here. And so it begs the next question, which is, what do we do about it? So here's a quick graph that kind of tries to look at the model. And this is looking at labor markets, which we just talked about in the last chapter. And the idea here is that what we've seen is demand for high-skilled labor increase, and the supply has increased, but not by nearly as much as the demand has increased. And so what we've seen is overall more workers with higher education earning much higher wages. And that's just based on the nature of the technological advance we've experienced, right? It's less and less demand for factory workers, more and more demand for people with engineering skills, mathematical skills, modeling skills, computer skills, those kinds of things that have the ability to earn really, really high wages. So if we see demand for high-skilled labor rise as much as we believe, and economists believe we have seen it, we're going to tend to see wages for those high-skilled workers rise. Meanwhile, low-skilled labor is facing global competition, right? If a factory can find workers in another country that will accept a lower wage, they'll just move the entire factory. That reduces the supply of that labor, and it increases the supply of that labor and reduces the demand for that labor. And so we're going to see the exact opposite effect happening for lower skilled labor jobs, thanks to globalization. So the last section here is, what can the government do to try and reduce income inequality? And it gets back to a couple of different ideas. The three main tools that economists believe we can use to reduce income inequality are going to be income redistribution, increased access to the ladder of opportunity, which is basically this idea that once you get into the labor market, you can start to grow your income and increase the returns to your education and returns to your productivity. And then also a tax on inheritance or a tax on wealth, otherwise known as wealth redistribution. And this is where it becomes important to differentiate between income and wealth. Income is a flow of money, usually your monthly pay, your weekly pay, or your annual salary. But income is a flow. It's the money you get regularly. Wealth, on the other hand, is a store or a stock. It's the sum of your assets. So it's going to be your pension, your home, those kinds of things. And we don't expect wealth to change as much as we do income because, like I said, income is a flow, wealth is a store. And so we do treat them differently and think about them differently from an economic perspective. Okay? So when we talk about redistribution, what we're really talking about is taking some money from the people up here and giving it to the people down here, redistributing income or wealth from the higher income folks to lower income households. And one of the ways we do that is with a progressive tax system. And a progressive tax system just says, hey, as your income rises, your tax rate will rise too. And the higher your income goes, the higher potential tax rate you're going to have to face. Effective income tax is your total taxes paid divided by your total income. And what this means is if I make, say, $50,000 a year, then I'm going to pay a low tax rate, maybe 1.5% on the first $30,000. And then I might pay 2.5% taxes on the next $10,000. And then another 3.5% on the next $20,000. And so I'll end up paying a progressively higher tax rate as my income goes up. The effective income tax is the total tax I pay on all of those buckets of income divided by the total income I earned. And so the idea is most people pay lots of tax rates on their income as their income goes up. But their total effective income tax is a function of each of those tax rates they pay and the total income that's taxed. And I know that this is more than $50,000, but you'd imagine that, okay, they'd pay, up to $50,000 here. And so they pay 1.5% on the first, 2.5 on the next, and 3.5 on the next after that. And in the US, we use a progressive tax system to try to engage in some income redistribution. The next kind of umbrella of policies we could think of is this idea of the ladder of opportunity. And the ladder of opportunity says that, there are disparities in families, in schools. And so children face different access to wealth and prosperity. And so the ladder of opportunity says, how do we increase that access? How do we open it up so that despite the disparities of the families and schools and neighborhoods that children come from, they have access to every opportunity, right? They have access to the same opportunities, even though there are disparities present. And so examples of ladder of opportunity public policies are going to be things like access to affordable childcare, enrichment programs, universal preschool, improved quality of public schools, equality in public school funding, access to higher education, community colleges, college loans and grants based on financial need, opportunities for retraining and acquiring new skills and access to training opportunities, and also limiting discrimination in job markets, in housing, in education, and really trying to reduce disparities based on income from families of origin. And so the whole idea here is to try and give people the opportunity to rise based on their merit rather than the zip code they grew up in or the family they grew up in or the wealth they were born into. And so those are pretty popular programs also in the United States. And I'm sure you can think of some that you have experienced or are aware of. We're pretty good at those things in the state of California, but throughout the US generally. The other way that we can redistribute wealth is through an estate tax. Inheritance taxes or estate tax is basically just saying, hey, if you have a wealthy relative who dies and they're going to give you millions of dollars, some of that should probably be redistributed. And the idea is we're trying to reduce this concentration of wealth because money going through family to family to family being passed down over time tends to mean that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Inheritance taxes are not super popular politically, which is interesting because they actually don't affect most people. It only applies to those leaving more than $5.43 million in inheritance. So if your grandparents are going to leave you $5 million in inheritance, it still won't be subject to the estate tax because it's not 5.43 million or 5,430,000. So it's interesting. It's one of those weird policies that's not very popular but affects very few people and would actually benefit most people. Some people call it double taxation. It's called a wealth tax, a death tax, but it really truly only applies to a tiny percentage of individuals with a very high amount of wealth. The last thing is that we want to talk about today is something that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is this idea that economic inequality can be seen as a bad thing. And so if we think about this idea of the production possibilities frontier and being as efficient as possible, and we compare equality to economic output, it's possible that a little bit of economic inequality doesn't affect our output. So we could be at point B where there's high equality and low output, or point A where there's low equality and high output. And that's how a lot of traditional economics has modeled it. But as we've moved to a world where we see more extreme levels of income inequality, we might see it be more like this graph B here, where yes, F has a lot of equality, which comes at a cost of some output, but we can also have points like C, where really, really low levels of equality actually reduce output relative to points D and E. And so there is a trade-off between, economists generally believe there's a trade-off between productivity and equality, but there can also be negatives associated with high rates of income inequality. And that's why we see push towards increasing income equality, especially in the developing world and in places where we have really extreme income inequality, like something like that. So that's where we came into this as economists. So that is it. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you all next time.